up, you guys? Welcome to The Imagination. I'm your host, Emma, and I am actually really thrilled today to bring to you guys a different aspect of child abuse that we have not yet talked about on here with a guest that I actually met through one of our other guests, our beloved Molly Sky Brown, who you guys know from our 3-part episode. There's actually a really great survivor community and activism community going on Twitter right now, which I wasn't expecting. And my guest today has been very loud for the last 12 plus years on the topic of boarding school child abuse. And this is a really big, really big scale problem that's going on, not just in her homeland, the UK, specifically England, but this is also proliferating throughout the whole world. There's private schools and boarding schools all over. And a lot of us, even here in the United States, are familiar with abuse that goes on in the school system. So this shouldn't come as a surprise, but it surprisingly is very buried under the rug. And my guest today, Joanna Brittan, she's one of the few voices that I found and that I know of that's actually out there advocating and being an activist for this cause and being a voice for all these millions of children that are going through this. And how she knows about this is she actually has personal experience. She was sent to a boarding school as a child along with her 3 brothers. And it was a generational pattern in her family from her grandmother, her father, and then down to the children. And we're going to talk a lot about how psychologically this affects children, but also the abuse that systematically is built into a lot of these systems and is covered up a lot like what we see in the church systems with priests and child abuse that gets swept under the rug really easily. So we're going to bring some awareness to this. I hope you guys will pay attention. We're actually going to break this episode up into 2 parts. Today, we're going to talk about that childhood aspect of Joanna's story, going through the system. We're going to learn about the abuses that take place and how important this is that we make this publicly aware and we start doing something about it. And Joanna is actually a survivor herself. She was a rape and potential trafficking survivor through a rich elite family out in England. And we're going to cover that in the second part of the story. It's very harrowing and she has been through a lot. And this information that you're going to hear today, I think it's one of the more important things that we've touched on in this whole podcast series, because there's so many children that go through school systems. If you're a parent, you probably have children too. And even if it's not a boarding school, this stuff happens in public schools and in private schools and in normal school systems, all the way up to the college level. And it's something that it's just not talked about enough. So I'm really excited and honored to bring to you Joanna Brittan. Joanna, thank you so much for being here with me today.
Emma, thank you so much. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to come on and talk and
oh my gosh, of course.
Be so interested.
Yes, I've been following you on Twitter and I've just been so captivated. I'm getting these little pieces of your story. And then our beloved Molly, I love how you and her have come together so much on that platform. And I think as we get into the second part of your story, your and Molly's story actually really intertwine. So we're actually talking about doing a 3rd part where we bring Molly on, which I'm really excited, but you guys are going to get a really well-rounded story from childhood all the way to adulthood on so many different things that Joanna's gone through. And I'm really thrilled about that. So I appreciate you being here with me because I think your story is really important. And when I was listening to some of the interviews that you sent me, I was just sitting there with my jaw dropped and I'm thinking, how is this so common? And I've never heard of this. I've never even thought of it. If anything, I feel like boarding school, when you watch it in movies, the way it's looked at as this really rich elite thing that only a select amount of kids get to go to, and they're really special and it's this amazing experience. But you've really come forward and with your work these last 12 plus years, amplifying a different side of the story that isn't talked about. Yeah. So I'm excited to get into that today. So why don't we start with your childhood? I'd love for you to maybe talk a little bit about your parents, talk about your family, where you grew up, and then we'll move into the school system topics that we're going to get into today.
Yeah, okay, lovely. So I'm from the south of England, and my parents, so as you were explaining that they're all boarders, it's in the family, and my father's side were Roman Catholic. They were from Wales, from a place at Denbighshire, a military family, Colonel Godfrey, and my grandmother was sent away. So he was my great grandfather, and my grandmother was sent away to a Catholic boarding school in Teignmouth, and I think it would have been very strict. And she in turn sent my father at the age of 4, to a Catholic boarding school that was quite new in Bournemouth, that was run by De La Salle, and the Jesuit order, and then the De La Salle group took it over. And then after that, he went to Dartmouth Naval College, where Prince Andrew went. And he joined the Fleet Air Arm and became a naval pilot. Then he was pensioned out of the Navy because he nearly died when he was 28 of a burst peptic ulcer. And I think my elder brother was born then, and he'd put his name down for Sherborne at birth. He wanted to send us all to boarding school like he'd been, and he was expecting the armed forces to pay for it, because in this country it's really expensive, and diplomatic corps and the armed forces tend to pay for it for sort of top education for the top brass, top ranking officers. So he nearly died of a burst peptic ulcer doing some cold weather trials on helicopters in Canada, and he was flown back and operated on and lost half his stomach, and had to sort of find his second career. And he had an amazing job doing aerial photography, and he filmed lots of movies like Bond films, and he was a very daring pilot, so he used to fly the lead cameraman, Where Eagles Dare, the Mackenzie Brake, and I don't know about Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, but he knew the people involved with that. On Her Majesty's Secret Service, which was a Bond film with the helicopter sequences and stuff. He was a really gifted pilot. And so in the end, he went out to Qatar with Shell to start with, flying helicopters around the oil rigs. And then he ended up setting up the Qatar Air Force as one of the chief test pilots. And this was in 1971 to 1973, that sort of time. And then we were living in Hampshire, and I used to go to school with my older brother. It was, just normal life, really. And then when we were, I think I was 7 and 9, my brother was 8 or 9. Our lives changed so dramatically. We used to sort of share a bunk bed in a small bedroom, and the boarding school thing happened. My father went first to Qatar, and we were taken to our chosen schools. And I remember meeting my brother's headmaster in his study, Robin Lindsay, and I was really shocked that my parents were going to leave John with, I can say his name because he's waived anonymity in the case. But, I was really shocked when I met Robin Lindsay that, John was going to be left there. And then a term later, I was taken to my girls' prep school because his school was only boys at that stage. It was a prep school. So prep schools are age kind of, generally speaking, 7, although sometimes younger, to about 12, 13. And they're called prep schools because they prepare you for a common entrance exam, which is very competitive to attend the most elite schools in the country. So a lot of the children in Sherborne Prep would go on to the Sherborne big schools, or Eton, Harrow, Winchester, a bunch of elite schools in the area. And the parents sometimes lived abroad, or they were military or diplomatic corps, or just international businessmen. But the boarding element was really important. Some of the children in Sherborne Prep, their parents lived locally, and they were day children, so they weren't prey. It was the night boys, which had only made up a third of the school because it was urban, that were the prey. And unfortunately, my 3 brothers were all sent there for 5 years each. And my parents didn't know that the man who owned it, and his father owned it before him, he was also a sadistic pedophile, that that it was their private fiefdom. The father bought it in 1923, Fred Lindsay, and Robin Lindsay was born there in 1928. So he was, literally born in this sort of fiefdom that they owned privately, and they just did what they liked. And it was just unbelievable how the whole town, they groomed the entire town. And in fact, it was the big school that set up, they set up the prep school on their own premises to start with, and then it expanded and got bigger and bigger. And yeah, Fred Lindsay bought it in 1923, and then Lindsay was banned until 98. So that's how I say it was 75 years of pedophiles owning a school, and then 100 years of cover-up. So from 98 to now, it's been almost impossible to expose. And a lot of children were coming forward, and they weren't getting anywhere. I rang the school, and I got blanked by the headmaster. They said they didn't know anything about Lindsay, and he was living next door. I knew he was living next door. It was absolutely crazy. And the Department of Education sat on all the data. So eventually it was picked up by the Independent Inquiry into Child Sexual Abuse. I lobbied various MPs, and other survivors were all helping. It wasn't just me. Some of the survivors had been trying since 98, when the tribunal happened. But even earlier than that, one of the survivors was going back in the 70s. He kept returning to the school to try and get closure, or to sort of see if he'd been right. And then the guy tried to prey on him again as a teenager. And my elder brothers returned to visit a younger sibling, and the headmaster felt that they were, he owned them, that because it was his kind of fiefdom. He felt that these children were chattels and that they owed him. It's quite a weird thing, this business about parents paying for their children's education, because as a child, it's kind of, there's a lot of propaganda around it in children's literature with, J.K. Rowling's Hogwarts, Harry Potter stuff. But the older stuff is Enid Blyton and Mallory Towers, and so children read this kind of stuff, and off they skip and persuade their parents to send them, and then they get there and it's a one-way ticket because they can't get out, generally speaking. Once you're in, you're in. And a couple of people did ask me, if your parents knew you weren't happy, couldn't you have changed your mind? Couldn't you have, left? And I'm like, no. The trunk was packed, you were deposited in the school, and your parents were thousands of miles away in Qatar, and it just wasn't a question. Wasn't, I called it a one-way ticket. And
now are
I put a mask.
schools,
Sorry.
Are a lot of these schools remote in comparison to where
Yes.
people live? Yeah, so it's not even easy for schools.
So my girls' prep school was in the middle of the countryside near Blandford, called Knighton House, and it was very Blyton-esque because the girls had red dungarees and we were allowed to bring horses to school. A lot of the children had ponies and stuff, pets, and it was run by really benevolent, very Christian headmaster and headmistress who were kind and benevolent is what I mean. And it was rural, so I think most of the children were boarders. I don't think there were any day pupils, but because my brother's prep was urban, it was in Sherborne town, 2/3 of the pupils were day pupils. And when the police were investigating, they went to these day parents, and if you play that clip I sent you, the policewoman's talking about how difficult it was to get access to the children to interview, because the parents wouldn't let them. The parents protected Robin Lindsay and shielded the children from disclosing. But they weren't the victims, the day pupils. It was the children who were the night boys, who were the boarders, and they were in a quite a small minority. And how, knowing that 2/3 of the school were going back to their own beds, and their loving families where they could disclose. And my poor brothers were, stuck here with these townsfolk, covering for the bastard. Sorry, am I ever not? You'll have to probably edit that. Covering for the man.
Now, did you
watch
that video? I know I have your and for
yes,
people listening, I have Joanna's Twitter page. I really want you guys to go follow her. But what I'm going to do is bring up her Twitter, and she has some incredible links on there. She has this whole thread that we're going to flow through a little bit, different parts of it, but I want to actually play these videos that she's talking to you guys about, because I think they're relevant, and we will scroll down until we find them. Let's see here. Am I down too far?
Thank you so much for this. This is so clever because, you know, it's a really important thread, and I'm really nervous of sort of losing it. There's all sorts of things there about fagging, about the guy who bought the school, about, you know, the data's all there. This is a news clip from, I'm filmed with my brother.
So this is a 3-part. So for you guys listening, this isn't going to be us. We're playing a clip from her Twitter. It's actually a news clip. So here we go.
Calls for an inquiry into how the former owner of a school in Dorset was able to get away with abusing boys for years without being prosecuted.
Robin Lindsay was the head teacher of one of the country's leading private schools, Sherborne Prep. During his career, Lindsay was often dismissed as a harmless eccentric, but in fact, he was a fixated paedophile who abused countless numbers of his pupils.
Former pupils have spoken to this programme after an ITV documentary exposed Lindsay's activities. They're now being backed by Sherborne's MP, who says an investigation must take place. Claire Manning reports.
This is the face of a man who appears in nightmares to countless men who as boys were sexually abused by him day after day and night after night. His name was Robin Lindsay, and Lindsay was able to abuse boys because between the early 70s and late 90s, he was the head teacher and owner of one of the country's leading prep schools, Dorset's Sherborne Proprietary School. But how was Lindsay able to abuse so many boys over so many years? Well, that's something many of Lindsay's victims want answers to.
What I kind of felt there, it was that real empty desolation with this madman wandering around. I would rather have, you know, been anywhere than that place. It was just horrible. I mean, really horrible.
John was 9 when his parents living in Qatar sent him to Sherborne. He was to learn as a boarding school pupil. There was little escape from Lindsay's deviant behaviour. Now in his 50s, with his sister's support, John speaking out.
I remember him asking me upstairs to, while he changed, and he was standing naked in front of me. I thought it was very strange. I remember him putting his hand up my back, waking up and feeling this hand going up my back and rubbing it. And then he went, "Are you awake? Are you awake? Are you awake?"
It wasn't until 1998 an independent tribunal into Sherborne Prep forced Lindsay out, calling him a fixated paedophile and a risk to children. But Lindsay never faced prosecution. As part of my investigations, I've spoken to a few of the men who were abused by Lindsay.
Let's go to part 2.
Prowl the dormitories, deciding which of the boys he would abuse. One thing some victims want to know is how Lindsay was investigated by Dorset police on at least 3 occasions, but was never charged. In a statement, Dorset police told me, detectives spoke to all parents and pupils they were aware of during the investigation, however, were unable to identify suitable evidence for prosecution. Many parents were approached and a number refused to engage for reasons only known to them. All opportunities to identify further possible victims of crime were pursued. When interviewed for an ITV exposure documentary, the former chief superintendent of Dorset Police told journalist Alex Renton that parents they'd questioned had prioritised their children's education over their safety.
It was said to me on more than one occasion that the most important thing for the parents was that their children went to the required public school, and that anything that was done to endanger that, they weren't terribly supportive of at all.
Jill Donnell says she spoke to parents of boarders, but Joanna doesn't believe the police spoke to enough of them.
Lindsay's night boys were his prey, and you've got these day boys going home to their lovely families, and those parents are groomed by Lindsay, and they want their passes, their common entrance to Eton, Harrow, whatever. So approaching a day boy parent isn't going to get anywhere.
Lindsay died in 2016, so you may be thinking, he's dead, what use is an inquiry now? Well, for the victims I've spoken to, they say this isn't historic abuse. They say they live with the consequences of Lindsay's actions every day of their lives. Backing their calls for an inquiry is West Dorset MP Oliver Letwin.
Well, I've written to the police commissioner for Dorset to try and enlist his aid in getting an inquiry to happen. I think the natural thing would be for Operation Hydrant to do this. I think some of the victims don't want it to be seen to be done within the Dorset Police, which I can understand.
Operation Hydrant's the national police team coordinating some non-recent child abuse investigations. Sherborne Prep today is a different school to that owned by Lindsay. They told me the governors and all those now involved with the school find the matters raised.
Third part, I think there's a third part, Emma.
Raised in the allegations totally abhorrent, and have every sympathy for any victims and survivors who are subjected to such abuse. Sherborne Proprietary School is now an entirely different legal, financial and governance entity. We take the welfare of current and former pupils extremely seriously, and we're working with the relevant authorities in relation to these allegations.
If one person watching this has been a victim of Robin Lindsay and they watch us speak about it, it can set them free.
Yeah.
And that's my hope.
I'm proud of just being here and being able to just express what I really feel, and that other people will come forward. Oh, this isn't over.
John hopes by talking, others will no longer live with the shame so many have felt because of the loveless place that once was Sherborne Prep. Claire Manning, ITV News, Sherborne. And by Lindsay, they told me the governors and all those now involved with the school find the matter.
Wow.
Thank you, Emma. Thank you. I haven't seen that for a long time. I just, it's just sort of buried there under my pinned tweet. But
Oh my gosh. So what year was that this was?
2018. That was 3 years ago.
Okay. And what year did you start bringing awareness to this in whistleblowing?
2008, 2009, really. I never stopped looking online, but there was nothing online. Every time I Googled his name, I was expecting to see something, and I couldn't, there's nothing about him. And then my brother disclosed to me on a beach on my birthday. It was my birthday or the day after, down here in Devon. He came down from London. He was in a show because he's an actor, and so I watched the show, and the next day on the beach he disclosed to me, and that was 2017 April, and I never stopped. After that I never stopped, and the next day I found this blog, which was a website, and I saw that my brother had already found it, and it was dozens of disclosures by old boys who are from the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s. Very rarely there was a voice from the 80s, but they were older men, no women, but all disclosing what Lindsay had done to them while they were children there. And it was the sort of scale of it, and it was what I'd been expecting to find, because I'd always known, but my brothers hadn't shared because they were too young. I didn't think they were ready, and until my brother was 54, when he actually disclosed. And that's why I say I think that survivors disclosing in private education are generally older than other groups of survivors, because of the money involved, and the fact that it's quite difficult, that you imagine as a child that your parents are complicit because they've chosen it for you, also, when you go home in the holidays, there's so much emphasis put on the academic, the cost of it, and there's sort of demands put on you because it's competitive. It's a competitive system, and there's that financial investment. So my father always paid huge attention to our school reports, and so I strove really hard to be quite scholarly, really, and get really high marks. But because I was a girl, he never paid it much attention. And whereas my brothers always got rewards for getting a B or higher in maths, for example, he used to make comments like, "Oh, do they teach girls needlework and cookery anymore, Joe?" Just because he didn't have a daughter, he was an only child, and he didn't grow up around girls, so he didn't really understand. But yeah. So when I took my A levels, and he said, "Jo, how do these compare with the boys?" I said, "They're exactly the same, Daddy." The shock on his face, it was funny.
Well,
Yeah, because I'd
hard
done
part.
quite well, and my
Parents genuinely are in their mind probably thinking, gosh, I'm setting my kid up for success. I'm paying extra to get them into this really exclusive elite school. And that has to be really hard, because a lot of abuse cases that happen where parents are complicit, it's where the parents are actually abusing, not their intent isn't to do something good for a child. So that has to be really confusing as a kid to say.
Really confusing.
Yeah.
Really confusing, because it's misrepresented in children's literature. So you're expecting something magical as a child, even as your trunk is being packed and you're having name tapes sewn, and there's a lot of fuss before you go, as it's all organized. I was talking on another podcast about this. There's a lot of planning that goes into it. It's a really long-term investment. So you have, 5 years in a prep school, 5 years in a senior school, and then university. So it's all set up like that. And so when my father put my elder brother's name down at birth, he knew that this was what he was intending for all of us. And then he had 4 children. So, imagine the expenditure of 10 years per child. And Sherborne's not cheap. You can have a look. It wasn't, obviously, I don't know how much it was at the time, but I remember my father saying, "I've paid 144 school bills or something," by the time my youngest had finished. Yeah, it's something they believe in. And having been through the system, it's hard to know the level of abuse or violence that they themselves experience. But with the fagging system, I know you had what's his name, John, a policeman you were interviewing.
John Wedger.
Sorry?
John Wedger.
Yeah, that's right. And he was summing up all the various systems, really eloquently, I thought. But he did touch on fagging and the fagging system in these schools. And that was still happening until really fairly recently, same as the caning children, beating children with sticks, canes, was happening, I think, until it was much later in private schools than in England than in state schools. It was abolished in state schools, and some parents would pay the headmaster to carry on beating their children because they believed in it. And they use this expression in loco parentis, and Robin Lindsay loved that expression. I have the authority to beat you. And my poor youngest brother was left there over half term sometimes alone with Robin Lindsay. And he made a comment. He said, "Nobody's spent more time in boarding schools than me." I was like, it's so sad. And I did tell you that he's lost his country. He's lived in, well, at one count, 89 different countries, but that he never intends to come back because of the abuse of Sherborne and how damaging the whole 10-year experience. Not just in the prep school, but in the big schools who knew and did nothing to support the children coming through, knowing that the man running the place was a deviant. They all knew, the whole town knew, it was common knowledge. I mean, he was referred to as, that pervert, or, in very derogatory terms by a lot of members of the public of the town. And when they bought the school, the big schools used the vicar of Sherborne to buy it for £1 as a middleman. He was a grammar school boy. He wasn't kind of part of that world. And he was a governor of the big school, but he was used as a go-between because they didn't want to get their hands dirty dealing with him. And then so by using the vicar, it put a sort of veneer of respectability on the transaction. And you can see from my pinned tweet, you can see that he's standing at his retirement ceremony. Canon Eric Woods is blessing this bronze bust of Robin Lindsay. He's got his hands on it. He's meant to be a holy man. Like, what the hell is he doing when the guy's been outed as a fixated pedophile and banned from the premises? It's really shocking. You know, he groomed the whole town, the Lindsay family, and even today, the whole town's in denial, which is why I really want this thing called Loud Fence. This movement, I sent you a couple of articles about Loud Fence. So the school's sort of built around the Abbey. The Abbey is the focal point, but historically, these public schools are both royal and religious in provenance, in history. So when you have the Queen as the head of the Church of England, and you have these schools that boast in their literature of you know, they've changed it now. I've noticed that they've changed it, and they don't refer right back to their history, because the implication of referring back right back to King this or King that, who set up the school or who did this or who did that. They used to do it a lot. They'd refer to the royal provenance of the school, and now they don't, because it shows how they pick and choose which parts of history they want to promote and which alumni they want to promote. And those who are calling out abuse would never ever, you know, be anybody who was championed or who was supported. So I wrote some open letters to the schools, because I wanted to bring it all into the open, and I put them on Twitter, and I put them in a Facebook group, Boarding School Action Facebook group. And I just said, you know, this is the damage that your schools have done to my family. And you knowingly bought the prep school for £1, and you whitewashed the history. And, you know, why haven't you done anything for survivors? And I got this sort of response from the chairman, who's David Leakey, who was Blackrod. You know, they're all the people who are put in positions to cover up child abuse, really, are kind of prominent, often military, these sort of positions of authority. And it doesn't mean anything to me, because, you know, it's child abuse they're covering up, you know, decades and decades of it, because the reputation is much more important than the value of a child's life. You know, I don't know how many children would have killed themselves, but, you know, not everybody's a survivor. And I know that, I mean, my brother's been deeply suicidal, and another of the victims I'm in touch with quite frequently, you know, they get so low. These are men in their 50s or 60s, and the damage is really profound, and there's no support. They haven't received a single penny. And, you know, they're lucky if they get any mental health support. The schools have done nothing, and I think it's disgusting, because they're so rich, and they, you know, they still keep going on about how children are their #1 priority, but the children are a business, and they never were, and they never will be, because they'll always prioritize their reputation. And in this country, we don't have mandatory reporting of child abuse. You have it in Australia, which is very, what's the word? It's sort of leading the way. They're really progressive in terms of child protection, and the movement, the Loud Fence movement, came from there, which I love. I love the idea of returning the shame back to the institution where it belongs. And I'm not sure what the law is in America in terms of mandatory reporting, but in England, I was saying to the Dorset police officer, surely it's a crime, surely there's something criminal in what the schools did in covering up the child abuse and not reporting, not ever, you know. Some of the people who were teaching my brothers, the safeguarding officer from 1975, who taught all 3 of my brothers, and he taught rugby with Robin Lindsay, and he was the nominated safeguarding officer. He never reported on Lindsay, and he's still there. He's still there 45 years later, still teaching in the school, promoted. He's their most senior master. And I reported it to the police, and I said, surely he failed his duty as a safeguarding officer to all 3 of my brothers, and he vouched to the judge in the case. Surely there's something about the case that's criminal. Surely somebody there for covering up the child abuse ought to be held to account. But I got the feeling that the police would have liked that to be the case, but in fact, in law, it's not a crime to cover up child abuse, and so they will carry on covering it up, just like the church. It's not illegal. And I want it brought in, mandatory reporting. So I support this guy and this website, Mandate Now, which is calling for mandatory reporting. And he knows exactly why it hasn't been introduced. And it's a very expensive measure, but it needs to be, because, we're dragging our heels behind the rest of the world. And this country doesn't value children at all. They just don't. It's really shocking. I don't know why we don't have it. And Boris Johnson is not the person who's going to introduce it, in my opinion, because he sent all his children to Ashdown House, and his father was at Sherborne School, living right next door in Lion House to Robin Lindsay. Turn a blind eye to it. And not the shocking thing about Boris Johnson's family is that they send their own children to that school, and they called it Pederasty Towers. They send their own children to the very same place, which is listed at the Independent Inquiry for Child Abuse. It's just sick, really.
Well,
why would he do that? And his sister did it as well.
So you think too, these schools must be making these countries and these areas tons of money. So there's a lot at stake if they get exposed, especially because of all the big names. Who wants to say, somebody like Boris Johnson, who wants to be up on a pedestal, does he want to admit that a school he went to is molesting children? Right? It's like,
if you look under my pinned tweet, there's an article in the Times, and it was meant to be about Sherborne, but it went to Alex Renton, and he wrote about the fact that 2 years ago, Boris Johnson had made a private secret apology to victims of Ashdown House. I was absolutely appalled that he hadn't sort of shared that. And Boris Johnson had made some terrible remarks on LBC radio, talking about the money, the 60 million was money spaffed up the wall in historic abuse cases. He had no time for it. He said, he was saying, the police should be out on the streets, doing the job they ought to be doing. And it was wasted money. And he called it spaffed up the wall, which is an expression you won't understand probably, but it's a sort of British, it's a really ugly expression. It's very rude. It's sort of a schoolboy expression for wasting money anyway, is what he meant. But it's so unbelievable that he used that expression so casually, and I think he does it to shock, but no, zero compassion, and he's a product of these schools. It's shameful. Here you can see Prince Andrew. So you've got it on. This is about the franchises, which Prince Andrew says they're worth billions to the British economy, and that article was from 2008. 2009 when they opened Sherborne Prep in Qatar, and then the big schools were franchised on the back. But as the UK trade envoy, that was one of his roles. And then Gordonston gets franchised in Nova Scotia, and then they both look to Wuhan after that. China, Sherborne looks to Wuhan, and Gordonston to China as well. So it's under
I'm not able to scroll through it because I need a
sorry about that.
It's okay,
but it's all about Sherborne and the Royal family and all the other school franchises abroad. But what's so painful really, and why I feel such a sense of responsibility about Sherborne and Qatar was that my father was the person who introduced the royal family to the Sherborne school system. Because they were buying helicopters in Yeovil up from Westlands, and I used to meet the delegates as a Sherborne girls' school, schoolgirl, when I was, I don't know, 13 or 14 years old. I was meeting all these Qatari pilots in the Post House Hotel for dinner with my father, and they were over there buying helicopters. And my dad would at dinner talk about his 4 children who are all at the Sherborne schools and say, this is how the system works. You have a prep school, girls' school and boys' school, because they segregate the girls and boys like they would in Qatar, of their religion. And he said, you know, the beauty of Sherborne is that, you know, you have all three in one town, and he felt that them living out there would help geographically. Yeah, and so because he sang its praises so much, the Catterall family then exported the whole system out to Qatar, and you know, they profited like mad. But it's the money in the Sherborne name that, in my opinion, made the cover-up so profound and made it so much more difficult for victims to be heard. They had no interest in hearing us, and they lied to me continuously every time I approached them. And then so this loud fence would be a wonderful thing, I think, to bring to Sherborne, because it returns the shame, really. The victims get a voice. And sometimes while I've been doing this work and becoming more vocal about it, I found that old boys have tried to silence me. You know, they think it's a man's world, this kind of, and it is really. The girls' school kind of ate the boys' public schools, but it's you know, some of the survivors of Sherborne Prep were girls as well. And, you know, I feel a responsibility to speak up, not just for my three brothers and my late father who's dead, but also for the girls who are Robin Lindsay's victims, because nobody expects them to be. And there were 10 core participants at ICSA, and 2 of them were women. And even ICSA didn't mention that. They didn't let any of the victims speak, and it was meant to be an inquiry that's victim-led. And the person running it, Professor J, silenced them, said they were closed preps, which they weren't. They doubled in size and were franchising. There was nothing closed about them. They'd, you know, sort of changed the name in order to avoid liability. And but the vicar who bought it said, you know, when I bought it, I bought the liabilities too. And Robin Lindsay had, you know, changed it into a charitable trust in April anyway. So nothing about it was new. It was just Sherborne Prep minus Robin Lindsay, who was banned, who moved next door, and probably carried on abusing children in his 4-bedroom house, which was part of the Sherborne Prep estate. It was really shocking. And then no criminal charges ever brought. And that's what I was trying to do early on while he was still alive. I was trying to get him jailed. And I couldn't find anybody, any help. And when my lawyers wrote to the Ministry of Education, the Department of Education, and the minister, which was Michael Gove, they wrote in, was it? I can't remember which year it was, sorry. Anyway, Michael Gove was the Minister of Education. They sat on it and they claimed Data Protection Act, and they wouldn't release any of the information. And now, if you look on the Independent Inquiry's website, where all the evidence in the residential schools investigation is stored, there are nearly 400 documents, and the majority are on Sherborne. And when under a Freedom of Information Act, I asked for various reports about the tribunal, the findings. And if I'd had them when my solicitor first asked, there was a chance that I could have had him jailed. But because they didn't release them, yeah, it was 2011, that's right. And they'd opened the franchise in 2009. So, you know, they wouldn't have wanted the negative publicity. And that's why the Ministry of Education just sat on it all. It's really shocking. I don't know how they can live with themselves, but, you know, it was the ruin of my family, to be honest. You know, I don't see any of my family, really. We're all completely scattered and doing different things, but there's no family, really. You know, nothing to bring us back together. Although they appreciate the work that I'm doing on their behalf, you know, the fighting that I've done. You know, I'm from a military family, you know, going right back on my father's side. So it's, you know, there's a soldier in me. And, you know, these old boys who want to silence me because I'm a female, you know, I don't care what they throw at me or say, because, you know, I represent too many people. I've got too much of a sense of responsibility. I remember John Wedger who was talking about, you know, it's the children that matter. It's not what anybody throws at him. it's just like water off a duck's back. Same with me. The levels of outrage in me are so huge that my father was defrauded, and that, you know, everybody knew and did nothing. And they just took all that money from my parents, knowing that this guy was abusing children for decades. And then, oh, I don't know.
Well, and
It's just
what your brothers went through, you know, and how they're still processing.
yeah, yeah.
And that you're not just fighting for them, like you said, like this is still happening.
Yeah, I know siblings, girls who've lost their brothers, you know, and they're always in my mind.
Like
You know,
more
how lucky
statistics.
I am that my brothers are still alive, because it's you know, not always the case. And although I don't see my youngest brother, you know, he's so lonely. You know, I can't imagine being there for half term with that man, and all the other children in the school have gone home. You know, even abroad for half term, 10 days or whatever it was, you know, and you're left there. How lonely. Just beggars belief, you know, that my parents would move countries in order to send us away. Can you imagine that? That's how much they believed in it. That they would sell their house. So when I was 7, and it was a week after my 8th birthday, I was left in this prep school. My mother was very cross. She says, you know, I never abandoned you, Joanna, how dare you? And that's how it felt to me, as the recipient, you know, as the child. So I was left holding matron's hand, and my mother, you know, left to go back to Qatar with my little brothers. And, you know, I was just in a strange place with a stranger, and you put a mask on, which is like a survival mechanism, really. And you can't show your true self. You have to kind of defend yourself, really. You learn quite quickly that you put this mask on, and then even in the holidays you can't relax enough because they're too short to kind of show yourself. So that I think from a very young age I just wore a mask all the time, and it was really damaging to me.
Can you explain to people,
taken a long time.
Boarding school isn't something a lot of people I know have gone through, even though they might be familiar with it. What does that system typically look like? How long are you there? How often do you get to see your parents? And what age is typically a starting point and kind of an ending point for people who are wondering?
Okay, so age 7 to 8 to start, and some children were younger, 5 or 6, and I said my dad was 4. But they just believe it's the best system. So you know, there's a film that was made called The Making of Them. So they send them away. It's almost like the empire stealing the children from the mothers, really, in preparation to sort of feed the empire. And for me, boarding schools represent a lack of mothering, an absence of mothering, because they're very masculine. Even the girls' schools are very masculine. So my prep school, you know, it's the same as normal school. You have 3 terms, but my parents were living abroad, and they'd come back to England for one holiday, or we'd you know, have a holiday abroad. But generally, from that age, I was flying on BOAC, which was the old British Airways, really, with my brother, unaccompanied minor. So we'd have no adults with us, all the way out to Doha. You know, I think the plane journeys were like 12 hours in the very beginning. They took a long time. And we'd have a company called Universal Aunts who would meet us and take us to our grandparents. So it's, you know, really young to be traveling, members of a junior jet club. You know, to me as a parent of 3 children, it's quite shocking what my norm was. But it was, and so there was a lot of, the whole journey was quite a big deal, from the school by train to grandparents sometimes, or and then up to Heathrow Airport, out to Qatar. You know, it's a long, but traveling back, I remember sitting with particularly my elder brother, who I'd, you know, been so close to when I was younger. We used to go to school together, we used to catch the bus together, and we had a normal primary school up to the age of, you know, well, up till I was 6 and John was 8. up to then we'd had a normal life. You know, we were part of a community. I was a brownie, he was a cub. You know, we had loads of local friends. What it did was sort of segregate us. We lost everything that was familiar, and they sold our house. You know, and I was put in an institution for the next 10 years. And what that does to a child is you kind of bond to the institution rather than your family. And yeah, and then the institution betrays you, which is what happened in my case. You know, betrayed the family. Like, you know, if it is successful, then, you know, and there is no abuse, then, you know, it can serve you very well. I suppose the investment could be really beneficial. But I wasn't abused in boarding schools, and the damage to me is really profound because of the early separation. And so in some of the groups I belong to, I advocate against early boarding. I think there's a place for it when you're sort of 16, maybe in sixth form, if you're needing space from your parents, and it's a very beneficial environment. But it's that early boarding when you're meant to have, you know, you need to bond with a family and be loved, and you're institutionalized, and it's done through your parents' choice. It's sort of willfully done, you know, and it's chosen for you, and it's really difficult for children to get their head around that. They want to please their parents, and they're given this childish literature which makes it seem like such an amazing thing, and they get there and it's really not. The reality of boarding school is really sort of cold, hard, empty. I mean, there'll be happy times and, you know, a few good times, but there's nobody to share, nobody to, and it's too long to wait 13 weeks because I only saw my parents in the 2 school holidays in Qatar and then elsewhere. But, you know, to save all of those things up for 13 weeks, and you kind of know your parents don't want to hear it anyway. You only share what you think they want to hear. And so traveling back with my elder brother, all I felt next to him, sitting next to him and sitting next to him in the car, on the train, you know, all the time, this long journey, was dread of returning, and he had to be pulled out of the back of the car seat, and I'm sitting next to him screaming, "Don't leave me here, don't leave me here, don't leave me in this." And you saw his face in that clip, you know, this hellhole. And there's so much trauma for him. He doesn't have, a couple of survivors have photographic memories, and one of them could draw the floor plan for me of exactly where the dormitories were and where Lindsay's bedroom was. But John's memory is really shot to bits. You know, there's too much trauma, and also from other children who tried to hang him in both of his schools. No, they tried to kill him. And there's so much gaslighting as well from family who don't want to hear it. Oh, it wasn't that bad, you know, minimizing and pull yourself together. Stuff I've heard for years and years, and then how unpopular I was for digging at it and not leaving it alone. And I just, you know, I was made the black sheep for the work that I've done, ostracized and laughed at. Actually, an uncle laughed at me. He thought I was ridiculous. I was trying to talk about child sexual abuse, and he was like, "Oh, Joanna, you know," because they were all sent to Charterhouse in Surrey. We were beaten 3 times a day. You know, don't be so ridiculous. You know, if you got less than 50 in geography, you know, and we used to take bets as to whether to go at the front of the line or at the back of the line, the front before he got his eye in, or the back when his arm was tired, you know. So we used to put odds on, you know, and he was laughing about it. And that's the stiff upper lip that John Wedger was talking about, you know. It's a training, really. And then they want to put their children through the same system, knowing how damaging it is, but believing in it. And it's in some ways it's like a cult, Emma. There's cultish aspects to it, and you know, by leaving it by sort of calling it out and saying, well, actually, I don't believe in this anymore. It hasn't served me. It's been really damaging to my family. And, you know, actually, we'd like our money back. Thank you very much. That's how I started my legal case. I wanted my father's school fees back for what I considered fraud. And the guy was still alive. He, you know, he's a rich man. I'm still living in Sherborne, like, but yeah, it was thwarted and obfuscation and nobody wanting to help me. And what's been really lovely in the work that I've done is connecting the survivors who've all been left in the dark on their own. So one of the loveliest things has been kind of hoiking them out of the darkness and connecting them with the police and with a lawyer who was willing to represent them, and, you know, talking about the independent inquiry and some MPs having their backs, kind of thing, and, you know, them feeling heard a little bit. But what I think Loud Fence would do is to sort of give it a slightly spiritual dimension, which has been so lacking, you know. Just somebody, Antonia, her name is, she made a label for me that was a laminated label, and it had my name on it, and it was for my family. And when I saw it, I cried. It was on a ribbon, and she tied it to a cathedral. And when I saw it, I cried, because that was the first kind thing that anybody done for me about this case in, what, 12, 13 years since I, you know, I mean, I'd known since I was 7 years old. I couldn't believe my parents were leaving him with Robin Lindsay. You know, I looked at him, and children can see maybe what adults don't want to see. And Roald Dahl talked about, you know, the shark's grin beneath the surface when he's talking about his headmaster and boy, his small autobiography. But you know, if parents don't want to see, children can. And I was like, I can see what this guy's like. You must be mad. And then it wasn't just one child, one of my brothers. It was, and the next one, and the next one. And it's a long time to have a connection with the school. You know, from 1972 when I first met him to 85 when my youngest brother left. You know, that's a long time to be involved with the school. It's not like just one child being there. That's like, what is it, 13 years, or sports days, just, and of kind of
brought up this point in a lot of your content. You've talked about this on Twitter, you've talked about this on some of your podcasts, and I think it's worth noting how you were almost saying it's cultish. I'd like to bring in a point that you've made, that if that's what you know as a child, is you didn't get to see your parents successfully raise a whole family. They did for a little bit, and then all of a sudden now you're being parented by people that aren't your parents for 13, maybe more years, and then college years, right? So it's like, and then you go to work. So you're constantly under the umbrella of people that aren't your actual parents to parent you. And I think that's interesting, because if a child doesn't have that complete picture of what a healthy marriage looks like, what parenting is, that's almost a subconscious thing. When they have kids, they don't know any different, right? That's, I think, probably why it's hard for people listening that are like, well, why, if a parent was abused, or if they didn't like it, why would they send their kid? And it's like, if you don't know any better, if you don't know what that's like, you didn't see it, and that's all you know, generation after generation, is this is just what we do as a family. This is what you do with kids. You send them away to boarding school.
But they willfully turn a blind eye to the dangers of it.
Yeah.
That's the thing, you know?
Yes.
I'm so angry about it.
Probably scared to let down the family, right? Like how you said, even victims, they usually wait till their parents die way later and come forward. Or they're scared if they do come forward, they could have the possibility of losing an inheritance. So again, a lot of
because these are wealthy families. There's a lot of power, a lot of wealth. And if you stand up and say, I don't like what you've done, you know, what do you call it? Blackballing, or like, if the teachers stood up and whistle blew, there was one guy who I connected with in the Sherborne Prep case, Rydian Llewellyn. He was a whistleblower who went to the police in 1985 when my youngest brother would have been about to leave. So he taught him history, and I had a school photo, but he just left. by then, 1984 or 85. And he went to the police. He was absolutely outraged by, what he'd experienced there. And he was threatened by the head of this umbrella organization called IAPS with blacklisting, that he said, if you ever speak about Sherborne Prep or Robin Lindsay again, he went on to the Dragon School, and then all these he became the headmaster of Papplewick, and he was David Cameron's teacher and also Prince Edward's teacher. So these are very elite schools. And at the Dragon, he was threatened. He said, if you ever breathe a word about Sherborne, you'll be blacklisted and you'll never work in private education again. And he didn't. He said, I think I was the first person he'd ever spoken to Sherborne about after leaving. And this is a very powerful organization that controls prep schools in England. Oh. And they were all headmasters inspecting each other's prep schools. So it was there was no outsiders really. So it is cultish. It is quite cultish. And they move masters around like priests get moved around, sometimes internationally, and they it's very, very similar to the church, the power dynamics, and it's all abuse of power.
Yeah, a little bit too of here in America, we have these, Ivy League schools. We have Harvard and UCLA, and we have all these just top tier schools that a lot of people know. And there's been a lot of scandals in those, but they're still as like, that's the standard. If you go to Harvard, no matter what you major in, that must make you this amazing person. And if you work at Harvard, right? And it's like, what is all going on that we don't hear about?
There's so much money in the background, and the sort of the buying of places, and there's been scandals about that coming out about I can't remember the word, nepotism, I suppose, or doing favors for people, and it's obviously quite embarrassing if it's exposed, but that your child didn't have the academic ability, and that you had to kind of get somebody else to sit the exam for them, fake. What do you say? Not fraud, I can't remember what you call it. It's cheating, really.
Right. But it in a way, it's not easy to understand, but you can see how cognitive dissonance, when there's that much money involved from the top all the way to the bottom, whether it's parents paying for it, to a state making money, to a whole city idolizing, this is our Yale University, go Yale, right?
Yeah.
Thing and our football team, and there's a lot to lose when these things get publicized to damage that reputation, especially of, let's just say you went to that school and you invested all this money and you become a lawyer and you went to Harvard or you went to Yale, and then all of a sudden that school is thrown under the bus and you find out it's run by child abusers, right? That tarnishes every single alumni that's ever been there too. It tarnishes their reputation. So it's like, you see how people could psychologically want to protect it or look away because there's a lot to lose financially through a reputation from every single person involved, including the area that it's located in. Because like I said, a place like Yale, or Notre Dame, it's like everything from sports to academia, it's completely idolized by everybody, and to think about that being completely taken down is very frightening, I'm sure, for those people in those organizations.
Yeah, definitely.
And so you can, in a boarding school, it has that same type of, elitism and all the expenses and the money that's made, and the people's lives that could be affected if these scandals get out and publicized.
Well, they have alumni lists, and if you look on them for Sherborne, for example, there's a lot of famous people. But I felt like inventing, having a new hashtag, alumni too, like me too. Yeah. But I'm alumnus of Sherborne Girls, and my three brothers of Sherborne, John went to a different school, but two of my brothers are Sherborne School alumni. And it's a bit like picking and choosing which bits of history. They boast of all these famous alumni. I don't know whether they actually get their permission to use their names and their photographs, if they are success stories, whether their permission is actually sought. But I was sort of joking about it, but I said, I'm their worst nightmare. I used to be an straight A student, school prefect. I was such a model such a model pupil. I, was really diligent and obedient, and as I talk in the next podcast, I sort of had this out with my mum a little bit, and she couldn't see what I was alluding to, but the way that I'd been raised in these institutions, I felt hadn't prepared me for, or had taught me to be really obedient and
Submissive.
Submissive, yeah, not able to stand up to myself. So when I was in dangerous situations after that, there was no protection, and I also didn't have boundaries or barriers properly. I hadn't been raised in a family, and I ended up getting preyed on, and I was trying to explain that the overlap between being institutionalized as a child, and then what happened, there was a sort of the war zone situation, then what happened immediately afterwards. That
I'd love for you, could you dig a little bit more into that from a child's perspective? You talk about something called boarding school syndrome, and I don't know if that's a term you coined or if that exists, but could you talk a little bit about what damage that does to a child psychologically, emotionally?
Yeah, I've got loads of books here. I've got a whole sort of bookshelf of books, but have I got her book?
I don't think that's something that people think about, like how we were just saying, it's looked at as the best interest of the child. It's one of the few instances where complicit parents are actually intending to do something good for their kid. It's not like no parent would send, at least a good parent wouldn't send their kid to boarding school expecting them to get abused in any way, and I just
I think my parents truly believed they were doing the best thing for us. I don't know whether or not my father was abused in his Jesuit school, but I think I connected with somebody who does expose the De La Salle order, and he said that there were 3 known abusers in my father's school, and that so the likelihood is, and he was in touch with survivors of my father's school. It's called St. Peter's, Bournemouth, that and looking at my father's behavior, he died prematurely, but I think it's very likely. But he didn't see what I saw in Lindsay. He just thought he was doing the best for the children, and he was a very practical man. So he was very military minded, and you have the prep, the big school, and then university, and so he was sort of setting us up for life. That's what the investment was all about. And the prep school was for the common entrance pass, and because he was a military man, he just saw the practical side of it. He never really considered the emotional side. It just didn't register, because that was what he knew. He had no siblings. He was like, right, this is what we're doing. And what he paid attention to, as I said, was our academic reports. But there was, that was our norm, really. And so you have generations growing up who don't know how to parent children. In particular, you've got the example of the Johnson family, Stanley Johnson, who's just being exposed as a sexual predator. A couple of women are coming forward about that, but that Boris Johnson and his sister Rachel call their prep school Ashdown House, they call it Pederasty Towers, and then they send their own children there. And it was listed at the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse. And then he makes those remarks about, throwaway remarks, which are obscene, denigrating the child, the independent inquiry. It's really shocking. How little regard, children are held in this country. It just breaks my heart. And so that little picture I sent you of the little boy tying the ribbon around a church in Ballarat, and his mother had said, he wants to tie the ribbon so parents know, to look after children. And he had no shame, and she's not hiding his identity. She wanted that photograph to be amplified and retweeted. And I just thought that's such a powerful message that, the mother's not encouraging the child to be ashamed of it. you know, she's allowing that and allowing, you know, this, you know, it's such a powerful action, and it's so positive, and it's giving the shame back to the institution that damaged you.
And it's
You know,
validating,
that's
right? Because isn't that part too of, you know, this
yeah,
syndrome that you talk about is it's very invalidating for a child when a parent is kind of like, you know, deal with it. I'm paying this much money for you. Like, don't complain. I'm
yeah,
doing some really big favors. You're going to thank me later in life. That has to be really,
yeah,
because on one hand, the child saying, yeah, but I'm really scared to go. I'm unhappy. It's an environment that doesn't feel good to me. I don't feel any love. I don't feel connection. I miss you. But I feel guilty telling you any of this because I know you're paying
yeah,
money. I know you love me. I know that there's probably something good down the road that can come out of it, you know, and I'm I'm taking your investment and like I want to do the best that I can with it. Like you said, making a parent proud. So that has to be really challenging for a child with this type of abuse to navigate it because again, the parent in their mind, like the parent's doing the best job that they can or that they think that they know that they can. But on the opposite end, they're not able to put themselves in the child's shoes and say, but what damage is this doing to my child?
I do you remember I said that there were certain flashbacks, trigger points that happened in my story, which meant that I remembered certain things. And the very first one that happened was when my daughter was 7, and I put her on a school bus to go on a residential stay just for one night. None of my children have been sent away to boarding school, by the way, no way. And it was this lovely sunny day, and these children were all in their own clothes going off on this coach to an overnight stay in Dartmoor, waving them off, you know, lovely day. And I got in my car, I started to cry in the sun behind my sunglasses. And I didn't know why, because, you know, why would you? She's really happy and they're all off, and it was only for a night. And I got in my car and I had this meltdown on, and I got this flashback to holding matron's hand, and it was a sort of a memory that I buried. And so I was saying, I think I compartmentalized trauma as a young child, that stuff that was too big for me and I couldn't deal with, I kind of compartmentalized it. And my nickname was Smiley, and I wore this sort of fixed grin all the time. And I just found that by smiling, people responded positively to me. And I think my elder brother, I saw that it didn't serve him to be weepy and complaining, so I did the opposite. And I was always sort of kind of rewarded with, you know, a school prefect, positions of responsibility, I suppose. But my brother had a hellish time, and yeah, so these masks. So boarding school syndrome was coined by she didn't go through boarding schools, but she was a psychiatrist, and she was having or a psychotherapist, and she was having a lot of clients, and she noticed that all the men and women who'd been to boarding school, who were coming to see them, were displaying similar problems later in life. And so she kind of looked at it in depth, and she wrote a whole book about boarding school syndrome. I've been looking for it, but I've lent it to my brother, and it's superb because, you know, she's sort of outside of the system looking in, and it's the most brilliant exposure of it, really. She also has a few cases that she kind of describes their trauma and how it kind of came out in drawings and this sort of thing, because the child was so young, and the sort of abuse. And gosh, it's a really powerful book. But talking about, even if you aren't abused, the separation at an early age is so very damaging. And I don't think my mother's ever accepted that, really, because she did apologize to my brothers in a round robin email, just a couple of paragraphs saying, you know, I didn't know, I'm really sorry, sort of thing. And I wanted an apology too. And it had to be one of my brothers who asked my mother to apologize to me for sending me away. And she was like, well, yeah, she wasn't sent to a school with a pedophile in charge, you know, she's got nothing to complain about. And one of her comments, which I shared with Ixa, was, well, at least you all had a bloody good education. Yeah.
Again, putting the academics above the best interest of
Yeah.
the child, right?
Really shocking. Like, I've got this really strong belief that I shouldn't have to feel grateful for my education, that it should be free. And in Finland, they you know, you can't pay for a child's education. It's not allowed. I mean, all state education is free, and there aren't private schools, as far as I understand. And for scholar or something, I've looked at it quite a lot, but I can't, it escapes me at the moment. But I like the idea that a child doesn't have to carry the weight of the parental investment, because it's a barrier to disclosure of child abuse. You know, it really is. And that's why I say children disclose later, because they don't want to disappoint their parents. They protect and shield their parents. You know, you know, you've got the shielding of the children, the protection of the children, but it works both ways. I used to do all sorts of things to protect my parents and not tell them things that, you know, I was in danger when I was traveling once. I remember we were in Jordan, in Amman, because it was one of the routes to fly out to Qatar to visit them in the holidays. And it was a cheaper option. So we'd gone via Amman, and I was in this guy's room and with my brother. And I think they'd done something sexual. I'm not quite sure what, but we were in danger in this guy's room, and we were unaccompanied minor. And I said to John, don't tell mum and dad about this, because I didn't want them worrying, you know. So that's a very clear example to me of what I do, not to have them worry about us, because I felt they had too much to worry about with our school fees. And you know, Dad used to stress about it, different things, and try and get my mum to work. And so I didn't want to bring worry, and so I always tried to bring good school reports and be a blessing to them, you know. So I never complained. But yeah, when I talked about the flashback to being 7 and holding matron's hand that I'd blanked, some other things sort of started to come out that I did. Behaviors, I mean, which were really damaging, and the kind of thing that I saw in this woman's book about boarding school syndrome. I remember being in my first dormitory at Knighton House, and I was the youngest in the school at that time, and I would make myself sick late at night on the floor, and matron would come in and clean it with disinfectant, and I'd be put in the school sanatorium with no food and no visitors for 2 days. And I did it again and again and again. And I think I must have got really thin. But it was obviously I was crying out for attention. I was desperate. And I did that. You know, it's so damaging to myself.
And that was like, making yourself throw up, or a different way of making
yeah, age 7 or 8. Yeah, doing that to myself. I remember doing it. And then there was nothing in my stomach really, because we weren't fed very much. And we had sort of a late night story and a couple of biscuits with matron in her room. Yeah, and various things like the tin baths. And so we'd have 3 pairs of girls would share a bath, and there were 3 baths in the room with matron supervising. And you know, there'd be a few inches of water, so by the time the 3rd pair got in, it was really dirty, the water. And of course the girls who started, you know, their period would go last in the water, you know, by themselves. And you know, things, because this is the 70s, you know, think how rarely we changed our clothes and stuff. You know, it was really, as a parent of my own children, you really don't know how lucky they are, because the stuff we took as normal, you know. But you know, a lot of it was happy. You know, we had horses and gymkhanas, and you know, I've got very happy memories too, because I was lucky that it wasn't sexually abusive, really, you know. But it wasn't really an abusive school, but it was just the general, it was just the being raised in an institution which really harmed me. And it meant that I've had problems parenting my own children. I haven't found it easy, and I'm not I'm not really hands-on. I'm not that engaged with them. I never really have been. I always sort of been taking a back seat and being passive, even though I haven't sent them away. It's been quite alien for me. And I've been to sort of parenting courses to try and help improve that. But I do feel at a disadvantage, aloof. I call it aloof, really. Not able to. And the same with the way I live. I isolate myself a lot. I don't have many friends. I don't connect. I don't have a community. And I see that with a lot of boarding school survivors, that they, I don't know, they kind of don't rely on anybody. They just become self-sufficient. And it's not a happy way to live, I don't think. It's just conditioning. And this stuff tends to show up much later in life, because and also it can make you quite workaholic. I know all of my brothers are really driven in terms of career. You know, it really matters to them that they make a success of their lives, and they're doing completely different things, but they are all successful. But the cost, the cost of it, that's, the price that we paid is too high. And the damage, Prince Harry alluded to it, actually. He talked about intergenerational trauma. What did you call it? Trauma. He meant intergenerational. So where you've got the older generations who are in denial about how abusive the system is. And you've got the younger generation who, it'd be very interesting to see if William and Kate send their children away, Prince William. If they send them to prep school, I'm not sure if they will, but that's why they exported Sherborne Prep to Qatar, so they wouldn't have to send their little ones away abroad like we were, because it was in our family. They want a common entrance pass, which it means you can access these top public schools, but they can gain it locally in Qatar by having the franchise. So all the royal children get sent there. And I didn't explain soft power. Have you heard of soft power, Emma?
Soft power? I don't think so.
Soft power. So soft power is what you get through education system, this elite education system. So the rulers of all the royal families of Europe and Middle East, and now China, Russia, they use particularly the British education system, and as a way of networking. And after the public schools, they very often go on to military, so Dartmouth or Sandhurst, and they're mentored by members of the royal family who know the system a little bit, or who might be in the armed forces, and they understand soft power and the networking, and it's kind of unspoken. That's what the British do really well, but it's really important, and nobody really talks about it, or it's not much touched on. But that's what I saw growing up. I saw that soft power happening before my eyes because of who my father's boss was, and how and then the Emir of Qatar, which is the richest country in the world per capita, was sent to Dorset to school at Sherborne International, and the way the whole thing sort of blossomed from there, and the greed of these schools, and the sort of the blind eye they turned to, what they must have known, that there would be thousands of survivors. And they prioritised their Sherborne gilded reputation because they knew they got this golden goose. Can you hear the children? They're shouting. Is it a bit noisy? Is it all right?
It's very faint, actually. It's fine.
Oh, okay. Yes, it's sort of that time in England here. It's quite late. So yeah, so it's sad, really. I mean, the only ray of light I've seen is this loud fence idea, and it was a shame that somebody was, that people would, when there's a movement that brings joy to survivors and connection, and that's what I love. That's the joy, has been connecting survivors who've all been left in the dark on their own for for decades, with this abuse, never being able to share or tell anybody or disclose until, much later, if at all. Then having connected like these dormitory whispers on this blog, and then finding some support, and imagine, being able to stand together outside Sherborne Abbey and having a loud fence and coming together and maybe, going to the pub or doing something together and having a group of you to connect and talk about and then maybe laugh, it would be so healing. And I actually think that these institutions should help facilitate it, should orchestrate it and really help make that happen. Did you listen to the noise that a loud fence makes? Did you hear
that on your page? Because I know I think you just posted that.
Yeah, that would be lovely.
I figured
I tweeted it.
Yes. Is it this one maybe?
Yes. Yes, Andrew's toy car. So that's the little boy.
And those ribbons you're talking about. Ribbons on.
I love that.
Is this on
his mother's?
These like the gates of whatever the school is on the outside?
No, these are holy buildings. So it's usually hallowed ground. So it'll be a fence around a cathedral or a church. And this is, I think, in Ballarat in Australia. So they had a huge Roman Catholic, church scandals. But I also tweeted one where you can hear the ribbons, the loud fence, the volume of it blowing in the wind. Did I tweet that? I think it was yes. Further down.
This one.
Maybe scroll down a bit. Yeah, there it is, down St. Patrick's Cathedral, St. Ballarat. Every ribbon has a voice. Just listen, loud fence. Can you play that?
Yes. Can you hear it?
Yeah. So and tied to every ribbon is a survivor's message that they might say who they are or they might not, depending on whether they want to be anonymous or not, and they'll tie a message or they'll ask somebody to make a message for them and they'll attach it to a ribbon, and that's their voice that they've never had. And when somebody did one for me, Antonia, it made me cry because I never had that recognition from anybody, for this fight that I've done for my late father. So I feel like a lot of survivors, they've lost their faith. My father lost his Catholic faith because of the abuse in his, he never disclosed to me, but from the way he behaved, I'm fairly sure, and knowing that there were 3 abusers in his school, it doesn't surprise me. But if he could have a ribbon in his name and that was making that noise, there's something liberating about it. It's validation and it's acknowledgement, even in a ribbon. And
I think that's neat too, that they all have a sound. I didn't realize that was kind of
when the wind blows.
Yeah, that's
so it's loud in different ways. It's loud because you're returning the shame. It's loud because you've got a message on your ribbon. You're saying, you didn't let me speak, and this is me speaking. So I think they're doing it in lots of different places, and Antonia is a sort of somebody behind it. But you can see that it started in Ballarat, and it's an amazing movement. And I'd be really happy to see it spread all over the world. I think America should adopt it.
I do too. I think it's powerful and it's something that's positive. A lot of
it's the only positive thing I've seen. There's been
people like they want to react negatively, and I understand that so much. Like, how could you not want to go just do something that's getting back at these people and something that's just as evil, right? And you can do stuff like that, going to court or doing it the right way, like what you're doing, speaking out. But I love that it's taking something so horrifying and making it beautiful.
Yes.
It's not.
It was the gesture. It was a beautiful gesture, and it was the kindness in the message. She'd thought enough to write my name and my family and laminate it, and tie a ribbon. And she photographed it and tweeted it to me, and it was just, it blew me away when I'd been fighting so hard for so long, and nobody would recognize the suffering and the damage that had been done. Just a little ribbon, and it wasn't anywhere near Sherborne that it was attached. It didn't really matter. It was just that somebody cared and somebody acknowledged our suffering. That's all survivors want, actually. And if they've lost their faith, and if it's something connected to a church, and I think there was a survivor who sat behind me at ICSA, Raphael. He sat behind me, and so Professor J had said that his institution wouldn't be included at ICSA, and neither would his voice be heard. And he broke down and ended up in hospital that night. You know, he was an absolute mess, because he felt a responsibility, like I do, to be a voice for all the survivors in this children's home. And, you know, a lot of them had died, I think, of drugs and whatever, you know. It was some of the residential homes are so much more damaging than boarding schools, because they're a lot more violent and even less caring environments, you know, they can be. And along with nuns, and I've read Raf's story, and I think what happened was, you know, with Antonia, he felt really validated, and it made the world a difference to him. So I don't, you know, people might criticize it and say negative things, but what matters is the difference it makes to survivors, and that they like it. You know, there's been too many people who love it, and immediately one of the survivors I know really well from Sherborne knew. He immediately wrote to the bishop and said, you know, I want this in Sherborne. I want this to happen, and it will in 2022. And the women are behind it. So, you know, there'll be detractors. There always will be, and I don't care. You know, I'm speaking for a family. I'm speaking for a lot of children who can't, but also for the girls. You know, the girls who are core participants who don't get a word. You know, there's a lot of people who need to be supported, and also, most of all, my late father, who paid the guy. So yeah, I'm not going to be silenced by anybody. There's too much responsibility, like Raf feels. But, you know, I'm carrying too much to drop it. And I said, having been a school prefect, I think I must be their worst nightmare, really. But I won't shut up, and I keep creating hashtags like Sherborne Shame, and which are all about returning the shame to the institution.
I love how
and alumni too, because they only want their gilded alumni. They don't want us. But point is, you know, we have to belong, because that's our school as well, you know. So sorry, it's heavy, and it's
it is, but that's why it's
so much joy in it.
And that's why I can see why you never gave up. You know, that now it's hard to even talk about this, even though there's more people open to listening. I can't imagine trying to talk about this back in 2009 when this was not on any.
I was so alone.
Oh my God.
I was so alone.
What inspired you?
But there was nobody, and I was trying and trying and trying. Like I couldn't have done more, and I couldn't get anywhere. It was impossible.
What was it that first ignited your flame, and what kept you going? Because a lot of people have gone through this, and you're one of the only people speaking up. Like, what makes you different? What do you have inside of you that you think allowed you to get
outrage?
Yeah.
Outrage. I'm outraged by their greed, and by the betrayal, the sense of betrayal that I have, where I was so good, and I was so diligent. I was, you know, straight A's. I was school prefect. You know, I gave them everything, and they fucked. Sorry.
It's okay. You can swear on here.
You edit that. You know, nobody messes with my family. I'm so angry that I've lost all my brothers. You know, okay, they really like what I'm doing, but the damage is in them, and we can come together and connect, but we're so divided, really. And then there's the generational rifts as well. So, you know, it was such a bad investment. And you know, so I'm looking to do whatever I can to, you know, get it acknowledged, but also, you know, heal, try to bring healing. And you can't bring that if you haven't had it acknowledged by anybody in the first place. And it's been such a lonely road. I've really been the black sheep of the family for doing this, because the older generations don't like the exposure. They're all, you know, all the older generations have been through this system, and they all buy into it and carry on buying into it and sending their children. And even some family members have sent their children to Sherborne Prep. It's extraordinary. Like, you know,
are you able to
they didn't
about what your brothers went through? If you don't want to go in crazy detail, you don't have to, but are you able, just so people understand, like, what types of abuse take place in these institutions?
So I wrote to so they had this panel, a tribunal. So the problem we had was getting rid of him, or the Department of Education had getting rid of him, because it's in England you have an awe of private ownership, and it comes down from the monarchy. So you know, this is a private fiefdom. There's an expression: an Englishman's castle, you know, home is his castle, is impenetrable. You know, he's the master of his dominion. And that was how it was when Lindsay was born in this place. And it was a huge estate. There were lots of outbuildings, lots of land, and his father had bought it. So he just felt like he could do what he liked. He didn't like any inspections or any safeguarding people coming in, what do you call them, social services. He felt they were beneath him, outsiders, you know. And also there's an English way, which is, you know, aristocrats or with private ownerships, you know, get off my land. You know, there's an awe of it. So in authorities, it's like the police, they work for the elite. You often feel that, you know, rich areas are kind of policed differently from sort of poor areas. So it's a bit like that with these schools. Sorry, what was the question again? I forgot what you'd asked me.
It's okay. I was going to see if you could share, whether it's your brothers, or I know other people have come and given you their own personal testimonies. Would you be able to see in some of the...
Yes. So I was talking about the woman on this panel who was the psychiatrist, Dr. Gillian Meze. She's a forensic psychiatrist, and she's quite famous. So she was the person who described Lindsay as a fixated paedophile, and that's how he got banned. So they had to go to the Lord Chief Justice to arrange this tribunal to get him banned, because the problem with Lindsay was he was the proprietor, he was the owner. And how do you remove a man who owns a school? It's not like having a member of staff who's a paedophile who you can move on or you can get rid of.
And he was very
how do you
right?
Yeah, really. So how do you get rid of a man who's held in so much esteem? You know, it's a real problem to get rid of the guy. And I think Freemasonry as well covered it up in the town. Masonic sort of structures, whatever, because I mean there were all these police investigations which never got anywhere, and you've got a whistleblower like Llewellyn, so it's mad. So when I said to Gillian Meze, the forensic psychiatrist, I wrote to her and I said, surely every child who goes through that school is a victim of Robin Lindsay, because if he is a fixated paedophile, you don't need any disclosures. You don't need to hear any disclosures, because his abuse of especially the night boys, the boarders, was so generalized. So he was watching children in the showers. He used to shower, by the end, he used to shower children at least sort of 10 times a day, watching them and showering with them in this Netherton house where his bedroom was. And they kept asking him to move out and he refused. And he would weigh the boys naked, and the way he did it was the matron would take the weights down, so she'd be in the corner, but he'd weigh them naked and they weren't allowed to cover themselves. And he'd sit on a stool, and so the groin was at eye level when they were when he was sort of peering at the scale, you know. So it was, but you know, disgusting. And in particular, he paid great attention to the rugby team, and boys who were overweight he'd take to the sauna in Yeovil. And I found stuff about he was packing condoms. He took children on a skiing trip and had packed condoms, and he was drugging children as well. There was medication, and I don't know quite what he was giving children, but they would wake up and they wouldn't know where they were, you know, how they got there, on sofas and stuff. It's all in the evidence under X, in case anybody thinks it's all made up. It's unbelievable, the stuff that I was trying to get early on, which was under DPA. They said I couldn't have it. So I got it after his death in, I think, 2017 or 2018. Under a Freedom of Information Act, I got all these documents released from the Department of Education. It was the stuff I needed in 2011 when I'd asked for it, when he could have been jailed. And it was Dorset Social Services reports. It was what all the staff members wrote about him and what he was doing. It was horrific. What else did he do? He would, with the rugby team, he used to take them to these away matches, and he was very competitive. His specialism was maths and rugby, so he would take the boys in a car to an away match, and he'd make them change in a lay-by so he could watch them from the car. Instead of changing them in the changing rooms at the little prep school they were playing, he'd do that on the way, and there was a lay-by that he always used. And then he used to let a boy sort of sit and drive the minibus and sit on his lap on the way back. It was meant to be a treat, but the guy, and there were, the police had reports of boys who'd sort of stayed overnight as a guest, maybe an older boy passing through or whatever, and they'd said they'd been assaulted in the night by Lindsay. And one boy, Lindsay was wearing a wig, but he was called Skunk because he used to smoke Henry Winterman's Slim Panatellos, and so his breath stank. And he also used to drink cough medicine. So his and what else did they? But he drank as well, alcohol. So he smelled of alcohol, but mainly it was BO. And it's a bit odd because he was showering with the boys, but he stank. What else did he do? But my point was to say this to the forensic psychiatrist, because his abuse of children was so generalized. He was a voyeur, and he was a fixated pedophile, so he was always looking at naked children and not allowing them to cover themselves, that they were all victims, because you didn't need to be raped by him. You didn't need to, and a lot of them were disclosing the actual assaults, the girls as well, the assaults that he'd committed on them, which they couldn't get out of their mind, they couldn't get out, it was really graphic. And when I copied the blog and I gave it to Dorset Police, Steve May, who was the investigating officer, wrote a letter for my GP saying I was a victim of vicarious trauma of Robin Lindsay, because I'd known him for so long and because it was so close to my own life. I'd read, dozens of disclosures, as well as being my youngest brother's representative. So I went to ICSA's Truth Project and I read out his police statement, and they recorded it because he's not in this country. And so he had to sign and do a proof of his passport and stuff to say that I was allowed to speak on his behalf. And I had to do that for him, I didn't want to be involved and do all that, but it's a responsibility that I have to bring this stuff to light, and by supporting my brothers. And now they've all had psychiatric reports done in Harley Street by the top shrink, because there's there's a settlement, there's going to be a settlement, there's legal action happening with his estate. And in order to do this, they had to all have psychiatric reports. And one of my brothers was really grateful for this, because, you know, he didn't see the depth of it. He didn't see really what the damage was. And when you have a sort of an eminent guy interview you who's a specialist, you know, and he can see what the damage is, you know, I've got it all there in black and white for all three of my brothers. You know, it was such a bad investment. I can't believe it. And there's no justice. It's, yeah. So a loud fence would be the very least they could bloody do. And I wrote these open letters as well to the chairman, and I got these responses that lawyers had obviously dictated to them, saying, you know, you're not to accept any responsibility. So just, you know, we're sorry for all victims of child abuse, and we're, you know, and Sherborne Prep has got nothing to do with us. So it was all about liability and not accepting any of it. It would have been better if they'd never responded, to be honest. And Sherborne Girls, my school, gave me exactly the same format. It was like one paragraph of, you know, we're sorry for all victims of child abuse, and then about 4 paragraphs of why they've got nothing, you know, why it's not their responsibility. It was quite shocking, actually. You know.
Have you received any help? Like, who has listened to you?
None. I think Dorset Police were probably grateful for the documents I've sent them, but I've sent so many documents to the inquiry, and I wonder if they inquire, if it's an inquiry at all, because they haven't shown any sort of, there's been no investigation. It's been like a filing exercise, you know, and they wouldn't even let the victim speak. So it's just a, you know, a waste of money, really. If they'd used the money they spent on the fake inquiry on survivors and mental health and some compensation for their abuse, it would have been at least money well spent. But I can't see what the inquiry's achieved if they don't even bring in mandatory reporting of child abuse, which is, you know, the only recommendation I can think that's going to make a difference. That this cover up that Sherborne have done for generations becomes criminal. And they can't get away with prioritizing their reputation, that they will go to jail if they cover up child abuse. Because it's not all historic. We have this thing called Everyone's Invited. This girl, they had it in Australia as well, and she was exposing kind of more modern day peer-on-peer abuse of sort of older teenagers. Mostly, I think it was really starting with boys' schools that had gone co-ed and sixth form, and they'd introduced girls to kind of dilute the toxic masculinity, the hyper-masculine atmosphere of these schools, which was causing problems. It didn't used to, you know, but so they allowed the sixth forms to go co-ed, and the girls were getting sexually assaulted by the boys, and their treatment was so disgusting that she set up a database where people could report child abuse, because they're children still, even though they're older, you know, older than prep school abuse anyway. And it started off, you know, a few, and it started off with the public schools. In England, we say public, but it means, you know, the most elite schools. We call them public. And then it was sort of every school, really. It was everywhere. But it did start off as a real problem. And suddenly there were 10,000 disclosures on this website. The girl, I think, never realized the scale of what, you know, the can of worms she'd opened. And the stuff was the way that the boys in these elite schools were treating girls. It's really shocking. And then you had a few disclosures of, you know, male peer-on-peer abuse with men, you know, but it was mainly women reporting rape by other boys and sexual assault and stuff. It's sort of not, how do you describe it? Just having, just like holding women in zero esteem. and also the women maybe having low self-esteem anyway. But yeah, really, really shocking.
Which that's interesting to me, because normally it seems like the survivor movements in general across the board are led by women. There's men mixed in, but I think it's also interesting that the boarding school aspect is looked at as more of a masculine abuse system, as far as the focus on male survivors and not female. And it's traditionally a little bit opposite in other aspects of child abuse. But I would assume that, given the statistics, that, and I honestly think it's flawed anyways, that 1 out of so many girls are abused. Sorry, it's my dog. It's okay, buddy. Yeah, of course. I was going to say, there has to be a massive amount of women too that are abused, just based statistically.
Yeah.
Women are typically abused
Yeah.
more than men. So to say it's a men-driven movement, I think doesn't do it justice. And I think you're such a powerful voice for men and women, because there's probably just not women.
Well, thank you. Yeah. Because I've had a lot of men try to shut me down, almost sort of, even the sort of the leading guys in the field, you know, the loudest people try to shut me down, almost like it, well, you know, this is a man's world, you know, what are you doing, you know, what right have you to speak? And it's actually been incredible. And I'm like, no, I'm not going away, I'm not shutting up, you don't dominate me, I won't have it. There's, you know, there's too much suffering in my family. I feel too outraged, and not only that, but the scale of the story that I'm telling, the Sherborne Qatar franchising. You know, my father. It's our story. We are the Qatar connection, and if I wasn't exposing it, nobody would know. Right. Nobody would know. You know, how the Qataris ever came to Sherborne. That it was helicopters. You know, that's how the Emir of Qatar ended up in Dorset, because my father was so in love with the system that he sold it to Qatar. And it's like, you know, and he had no idea. He died in 97 and Lindsay was found in 98. So nobody ever contacted my family. No, nobody ever reached out. So that's why that Antonia's gesture was so touching. It touched my heart. No, I don't think survivors don't need much, really. They just need recognition, and I don't know, some compassion, some small. What they don't need is people attacking them, and, you know, not working as a team and not seeing that we're all jigsaw puzzle pieces, you know, connecting. You know, all these survivors, these 10, I connected the 10 core participants. Well, there's not one, but the 9. And, you know, so you can see the pattern of Lindsay's behavior by these guys all talking about it and sharing and being willing to come forward and, you know, give Professor J their narrative. If they didn't have the courage to do that, and was still staying in the dark alone, you can't make a jigsaw, you can't see the picture. And that's what as I'll come on tomorrow when we talk about what happened to me, that's what I was doing. I was offering myself as a jigsaw puzzle piece. And that's what Molly was doing, exposing the MO of Ghislaine Maxwell in that particular case. You know, it's making your contribution and you know, almost as a responsible member of society to say, you know, can I help with this? Because I can see where my bit of the jigsaw puzzle fits. This is what she did to me, and this is what Lindsay did to me, and this is what, you know, and I just feel a responsibility to, well, Molly would call it dot connecting dots, but it all interlinks. And Callie was saying, you know, it's one big, it's all the same thing.
It's a network.
The dark. But you know, this all comes down from the crown, from the monarchy, and you can see it through the church. The Queen's the head of the church, and you've got these schools that are connected with Church of England. A lot of them have a lot of religion to do with them, the way they're built and organized and set up. And until recently, anyway, in the prospectuses and in the way they sold themselves, these elite schools would trade off their royal provenance and off their religious provenance. So you know, because you have Catholic boarding schools, you have the, you know, so you know,
but here's another
yeah,
thing. I had told you about this, but the boarding school aspect is one aspect, but there's many ways that children get torn away from parents, whether that's CPS, whether that's even having a nanny from the time that they're born and they get very little interaction from their parents and they have a nanny with them 4 hours a day or most of the time, or daycare at a very early age. These might not seem, CPS, we could argue, is an abusive system, but say have a nanny or going to daycare, we look at that as society and say, oh, that's no big deal. The parent's doing something great for the kid's going to learn something. They have another parental figure there. But really, we're not talking about that underlying issue that you said of there's millions and millions, I could even argue billions of kids in these systems, whether it's schooling or CPS type systems, foster care, daycare systems. What is the end result of how these children grow up without the attention being brought to their mental wellness and well-being after going through something that to them was traumatic, even though the parents might not have seen it that way, right? It's like how you said, you've actually taken the time, you've broken that generational pattern, which I commend you for, because you could have easily been like your parents and just been like, well, I wasn't happy, but I'm going to throw my kids in there. And I hope that they put their
just
kids
because you're afraid of your just because you're afraid of your inability to parent, because the aristocracy, generally speaking, when I look at my grandmother was a debutante, and the way she raised my you know, her children, so my mother and my uncles, were, you know, she had a wet nurse in the village, and they had a nanny, and then they had a governess up at the big house in Bewley. And these are all names on the RAINS list in England. That's satanic ritual abuse. So this is all in the New Forest. And I was listening to this guy read out all these familiar names like Palace House, Bewley. So my grandparents farmed the Montague estate, and their children were sent to Sherborne, and they shared a governess at Palace House, and they there were stories about, you know, playing sardines with the family. You know, they were great friends, and it was a certain social set really in the New Forest. But yeah, they used to go up to the attic and all play with this massive railway they had in the attic, and playing. So the people they were mentioning in the RAINS list were friends of my grandparents, and you just wonder about it really. I mean, it just seems so bizarre, the whole thing. And I remember them talking about Cub Scouts when I was a girl, and it was all sort of hushed whispers about Lord Montague, and he'd gone to prison, and there was stuff about the Boy Scouts and a lot of scandal around him. But I've been very fascinated by the stuff about satanic ritual abuse, just because it seems so far-fetched and so extreme. And then when you actually start looking, and then you see the structures, and particularly Callie is such an educator. It's amazing the stuff she's saying. So that you look at the Freemasons, which is what my brother in particular has always said has protected and shielded the Lindsay family. The Archbishop of Canterbury was head of the Freemasons, Geoffrey Fisher, and he retired to Sherborne. Yeah, so there's this sort of overlap. And then when you understand that the stuff behind it is you know, much darker than that, you know, I'm just sort of, it's all very new for me, you know, and it's quite shocking because some of it's really close to home. And you know, my grandparents to me were always good, and there wasn't anything like it. But the fact is that their friends of theirs are listed. You know, these places that I know in the New Forest are listed as places where these things happen. And you know, I feel more and more a sense of responsibility to kind of bring it to light.
Yeah.
You know, this dark stuff, because it's familiar. They're familiar names. They're familiar places. I'm well educated. I can maybe help. You know, because I can't stand this stuff being in the dark because it's caused so much damage. Right. And maybe maybe by speaking to you and doing this podcast, maybe I help somebody who's been left with a trauma, and they don't feel it's they haven't connected with anybody. Maybe they haven't heard about the stuff that I've been doing. So maybe they'll hear about it. Maybe it inspires somebody to do a loud fence in their town, or maybe, maybe they recognize they've been abused while they were at school. I don't know. But yeah, it's well, I was talking about the aristocrats not really wanting to parent at all. So it happened that my mother and her two brothers she said she was quite nervous of her mother, that they were presented at tea time to their parents. So the nanny would look after them. They had a tremendous social life, but the actual business of parenting was kind of, they paid people to do it. It wasn't their business. And so can you imagine that you just get presented at tea time? But I don't think, they were all sent away to prep school at 8 years old. My mother to a girls' school, and but that was just what they did. It wasn't really ever questioned. It was, and once you were in, you weren't pulled out. You just got on with it. Because I think if you allowed your child to come out of it, you'd feel that you'd failed, with some reflection on you as a failure. So my brothers were never heard. And then, even though John was really voluble about not wanting to go to Sherborne Prep and complaining, and every time he got dragged out of the car, because the younger brothers saw that it didn't serve him to complain, it didn't get him anywhere, they kind of accepted their fate. And one of them said to me, Joe, I made myself grey. I didn't want to be noticed. So he never excelled in anything. He just made himself Mr. Average to blend in and not be noticed. Can you imagine that being your Mr. Grey? Don't stand out, don't, terror. And then he remembered as well his first night there. I think the first night is something that a child, in an institution, when your parents have left you, there's all sorts of films about it, documentaries and things, but yeah, the sheer terror of waking up in a bed in a strange place and not knowing how to be in that place, how safe you are, who's going to prey on you, who's going to, utterly vulnerable. And then of course we had no mobile phones because it was the 70s, and we couldn't contact our parents. I think maybe I made 1 or 2 phone calls, but generally I never contacted my parents unless I was at my grandparents' house. So that would be like a 13-week term with no contact because they were in Arabia, and then this long flight, so you're not going to disclose anything because you don't want them to be upset or worry, so yeah, children are kind to their parents generally, they try to be, try to shield them, but yeah.
Like how you said, all kids, they just want to make their parents proud. They just want to be loved.
Yes.
They want their parents
to. Yes.
And that's a lot of responsibility for a child. That's like putting a college level responsibility on a young child.
Yeah.
We're going to send you
very young.
We're going to pay all this money for you to do this, and you better do good, good luck. And it's like, gosh, what a responsibility for a 7, 8, 9-year-old.
They'd sold our house and they moved country in order to do this, and told us how fortunate and lucky we were. I mean, I took one look at Lindsay, I was like, what the fuck? Sorry.
Kids know.
What a creep. What a creep. Why are you leaving my brothers with a man like that? He was disgusting. And, I saw through him right away. Like, who wouldn't? And yet my parents just thought he was wonderful.
There's been actually a lot of survivors that have come on this show that have said, one thing I didn't pay attention to as a parent was when I would have to send them to their father's house and they would be screaming bloody murder, I don't want to go. And they're just like, no, you're going to, like, it's your dad. You have to go see him. Right. And just like with your parents, no, that's your school. Like, I'm paying a lot of money. You got to go, but kids do that in response to terror. Like, it's, if a child genuinely loves people or loves a place, they're going to be excited. Like, a kid can't shield their emotions. They don't know how to. They're reacting out of, you know, that intuition that they have about things. And so I think that's really important for parents to recognize that too. The parents aren't taught that, hey, if your kid's reacting, don't force them to go do something. Of course, if it's like they have to eat their broccoli, like try to get them to eat their broccoli maybe. But at the same time, if you're sending a kid to say their grandparent or their father or a teacher or a sporting event, and they're screaming bloody murder that they do not want to be around that person, that should probably be looked at. Why?
Do you remember, John, you know, in the video clip you played when I was sitting next to my brother, he's wearing a Peter Cook t-shirt. So you can see that he's still traumatized by it even now. And my parents weren't with him, traveling alone, unaccompanied mine, all the way back to England from Qatar, you know, all the way on the train. And he's dreading every minute. And then he has to get pulled out of the car. And I'm the person sitting next to him, traveling with him. And I feel like I've traveled with him through life. And I've known that dread of his. And he shared things with me, like, you know, the times that the children have tried to kill him, tried to hang him in the theatre in Claysmore and in from a tree in the prep school, you know, his absolute dread of it and not wanting to be left there and the trauma of it. And you know, they waved us off at the airport. They didn't have the 12-hour journey of dread, you know, which is what I'm, you know, it's kind of in me as well as a passenger. And I was so nearly sent there, and thank God, you know, by the skin of my teeth, I'm not a victim of Robin Lindsay's as well, but I am vicariously. It's stuff I carry as a member of the same family. And you know, I just watched him take each of my brothers in turn, and I was there at the, you know, sports days, and watched him oiling up to my parents, grooming everybody, grooming the entire society, all the parents, all the children, all the teachers, you know. It's disgusting. And he was so good at it. And they know, you know, they know who to choose, who to pick, whatever. But I still think that you don't need any disclosures if the guy who owns the place is a fixated paedophile. You know, every child should be compensated, whoever went there, and the insurers should pay up. But if you own the school, it's a problem, because apparently it makes the insurance null and void, which means that no lawyers will take the case. So what I did was I got his estate frozen by the Lord Chief Justice of England. I wrote to the very, you know, that's the level I had to operate at. It goes high and keep going higher. Like, so the estate was frozen, and so there'll be something for some of the survivors. But I'm always conscious that, you know, he was only removed in 98, you know, and it takes much longer for these children to come forward. That, you know, they're like ticking time bombs. They haven't disclosed yet, you know, and when they do, there'll be nothing left for them. The estate, you know. So I hope there's a brave lawyer who will take a case against the schools for the cover-up, and for, you know, for buying it for what they've done, that it is seen as their responsibility, because it is. And maybe the loud fence will be the thing that which unlocks that, you know, makes them acknowledge it. So I hope to get a whole group of survivors in Sherborne outside the Abbey with this loud fence, you know, saying acknowledge us, and then we'll get press,
all around the
media
world.
coverage. Sorry?
To try to get people all over the world to do that. I bet we could get a network together, and even if it's
returning the shame to the institution. I just think it's a fantastic, you know, physical act to do that.
I do too. And so besides doing that, what can people do to support you, and where are you at in your journey right now?
Well, I've got my own stuff happening now. So with trauma therapy for my own stuff, I found it very difficult to access my own abuse, really, the stuff that happened to me after boarding school, because Sherborne kept getting in the way in therapy. It was such a big story that I couldn't access the things that had happened to me. So as I said, it was always a trigger, something in the news that caused me to come forward, and we'll speak about that tomorrow. But yeah, I'm speaking to the police about that on Friday, so that's really happening. I hope, anyway. Yeah, I'll save that till tomorrow. But with Sherborne, I think loud fence is going to be the next thing that can happen, really, that might help. I just feel the survivors are, they've had no recognition, they've had no settlement yet, and it's just been a long time out in the cold. So what I'd love to do is to gather them together and kind of have an event in Sherborne, and they hand back the shame, and then maybe have not a party, but kind of mark the coming together somehow, maybe hire a restaurant or what, I don't know, but be able to chat and not be alone with it. So I want to help organize something like that. It's difficult when you're not used to coming together and you're expected to be alone in the dark with it. They don't want you coming forward with it because they're protecting their reputation. So if you arrive with cameras and media and I don't know, any expectations, I suppose, of anything, I don't know how they're going to react to it. But Philip has already written to the Bishop of Sherborne, Bishop of Salisbury, probably, I don't know, I don't know the Church of England people, but he's written to the kind of people that need to know about it to kind of make it happen, to get the ball rolling. Yeah, and I'd like to widen that up so that any survivors of boarding school abuse can use the Sherborne loud fence, to put their own tags, even if they're in different boarding schools, all over the country. They can use that event and maybe come down there, give a shout out to their school, whatever, but it's most of all, it's the connection and the gesture and the beauty of it. There's a beauty in the coming together and the ribbons and the sort of authenticity of it, and the beauty in the gesture. So that's what I've seen resonating with a lot of survivors who've been involved with it, that it's meant up to them. It seems like a small thing, but it's been huge, for example, to RAF. I know it's been huge, and that's that's really important. Thank you for this, Emma. Thank you.
Absolutely. What an honor to have you on. All this is so valuable. Like I said, my head is still such a big story, and I can't believe that I've never been exposed to this aspect of this. So I commend you. People like you, like John Wedger, it's hard enough today in 2021 for me to do this. I mean, you see, I posted on Twitter, like, I'm getting bullied left and right and harassed for talking about, just for having guests on who talk about stuff, right? So I can't imagine trudging through that mud since 2009, John Wedger doing it for so many years and still going, despite the fact that nobody's standing on your side. You have authority to shut you up. You knock on doors.
I am quite like John Wedger. When he was speaking, I was thinking, yeah, we're similar.
You're both
because I'm not going to drop it. Yeah.
No, and you both have risked everything, like almost lost everything, and done it all because you care so much about other people that you're willing to lose everything to speak up for people that you don't even know, and it gives me chills and makes my hair stand up to think about it, because it's a passion I wish more people had. And if more people did, these problems would start to resolve if more people had that courage to say, I might not be popular talking about this, but I know that it's not, I need to stop worrying about me and get out of my ego and think about all the millions of people that my voice could potentially help. Like, we're lucky we have a voice. A lot of people don't have that ability. They're still in the system, right? They can't speak for themselves. So it's a privilege to be able to sit here on a platform in any type of way and say, hey, I have a message and I'm able to share it. I have a phone, I have Twitter, I have a podcast, so I commend you. And not just that, but you're breaking a generational pattern. That's not easy. There's only, I think out of all these systems, 7% of people get out and change it. that's a very small amount of people compared to all of the people that are still in it and that will continue it, you know? And so I commend you on that and for going, girl. Like, you inspire me. I think
Thank
you're
you so much.
you're a hero. You're an absolute hero. And these children need a voice. And what better person than you? You know, I meet you and I'm like, gosh, you are perfect. Like for this, like your voice matters so much. And like these children, you're gonna have so many people thank you one day for your work. And it might not feel like that,
Oh,
but like your voice matters and all your hard work, like it's going to matter and people are going to start to care. And I encourage people on here to connect with you. Where can they reach you? What platforms are you on?
it was so awful to be so alone in the wilderness for so long. And, you know, when I saw the blog the day after my brother's disclosure, it was just mind blowing because it's like I'd waited for it for so long. So I just want to make it easier for other people to come forward, you know, and I hope that there'd be a settlement, that there'd be mental health support, that there'd be, you know, that all these things could be in place when a younger survivor comes forward and realizes what's happened to them, that it's kind of, that they don't have to battle and fight and whatever. So on Facebook, I write quite a lot in, or I used to anyway, Boarding School Action Facebook, but mostly Twitter, like Callie, you know, except she's off it. I hope she comes back on.
I think she will. I think she's offended.
But I use Twitter mostly. That's about it.
Okay. And I'll link
Yeah.
all below for people. And if there's articles, if there's websites, if there's anything else that you want me to link, I can put that in the show notes for people.
Yeah. It's mostly that pinned tweet and then all the threads that come underneath it, and then there's sort of clips to videos. And I stood outside the back of the entrance of the prep school and filmed it because I was so horrified where Lindsay, when he was banned in '98, where he moved, and he moved next door on the estate in this big 4-bedroom empty house, and he lived there for about 12 years all by himself. And on the rear entrance of Sherborne Boys, I think it's the largest boarding house, called Lion House, where Stanley Johnson went. So he was their next door neighbour for 5 years or whatever. So there's over 100 boys on one side of him, older boys. And then on the other side, he's got the rear entrance of Sherborne Prep and the rugby field. So you can watch the little boys playing rugby in the fields that he still owns that he wanted to develop. So I stood outside. I was so horrified that he was allowed to do that with impunity as a fixated pedophile, that he just lived there for 12. And I know that he was inviting boys in for tea and they were stealing his alcohol. So I am sure that he didn't stop preying on children, that he carried on abusing. And what better place to live? And, you know, I stood outside and filmed it because I just found it outrageous that was okay with the Department of Education for them to just remove the owner of the school and put him next door in the place that he's. And even when they bought it for £1, it could, you know, the big schools couldn't afford to buy it, so it was a really weird financial transaction, really dodgy. And he still owned, you know, so much of it. They couldn't afford to sort of. It was just the school minus Lindsay who'd been moved next door, and he's not going to stop preying on children suddenly overnight. The leopard doesn't change his spots. So yeah, underneath my pinned tweet, you've got me standing outside. Well, I don't show myself, but I show Lindsay's house, and I show Lion, and I show the rear entrance of the prep and the playing fields, because it was so outrageous that he was there for 12 years and never jailed, never anything. I think it's just the level of outrage, but I don't express it because I've been brought up in these institutions where I'm not allowed to be angry. I'm not allowed to. So when you see the male boarding school survivors talking about it, none of them get angry that they were abused in these places. None of them are raging. None of them are. It's conditioning, and it was normalized, you know. But on a very, you know, deep inside me, there's absolute outrage about it, and I've not seen that in any of my brothers, and any of the survivors. Well, one of them starting to express it, and my brother's getting angrier now, but it was so deeply buried and inaccessible, really, because it was normalized when you were so young. So yeah, so I'm glad I'm able to sort of express that. Maybe it helps another survivor, maybe they'll hear me. and it touches some part of them that they understand, and they feel understood and heard, and make them easier to disclose or find support somehow, or come along to a loud fence wherever they are, you know, because I think that would be lovely, wouldn't it, to just come along to an event and tie a ribbon and feel that you've kind of got it out of you somehow, and you can leave it. Yeah, anyway, I'm not sure. It's still very difficult, you know. I'm still very aware of the damage that it's done, and the betrayal. And what really doesn't help is to be attacked by the people who are victims as well. And you're like, why you know, really just get on board and help. Don't attack me. I don't need it. I'm trying to help connect people and see the bigger picture. You know, you're just part of the puzzle. Doesn't, you know, there's no VIP survivors. Nobody's more important than anybody. I hate people being put on pedestals for something that's nothing anybody wants to show off about. It's not. And there's also no, you know, there's no priority. You know, nobody's more this than anybody else. You know, nobody's sort of. I don't think that it serves any purpose to compare how you've suffered to another person. It doesn't help really, because people are damaged, you know, in different ways. So it's very difficult to quantify when you're looking for a settlement that the level of damage that they should afford for the abuse that you suffered. I mean, you know, 5 years in a hellhole like that, and being left with a pedophile company, you know, how do you quantify that in money? Especially when my dad was paying the guy in the first place. You know, what level? It'll be very paltry, and it won't be any recognition.
But that doesn't take away any of it. That's just the tip of the iceberg of what they could do to help, you know.
Yeah.
And it's outraging.
And it's outraging that the responses that I got from the chairman were so scripted by lawyers. You know, there was no heart, no compassion, no sincerity. They're businesses, they're global businesses, and they don't care about children. They cover up child abuse, and they just want their reputation protected at all costs because they don't want to diminish the value of it. So, you know, if I was to approach the Royal Family of Qatar and say, stop paying these guys millions of pounds every year for a reputation that's not whiter than white, that's really, what's the word? Tarnished. You know, it's got a paedophilic history that, you know, you really shouldn't be promoting as distinguished. It's been misrepresented utterly to you. You know, maybe by Prince Andrew. I'm sure as UK trade envoy, you know, cozying up to the Qatar royal family, he was instrumental. But yeah, it's difficult. But thank you for hearing me.
You're welcome. Thank you so much for sharing. I know when I first approached you kind of said, and I'm so happy to hear you start talking a little bit differently, how you just did about how there is no VIP. You know, it's really easy sometimes, I think, for any survivor or somebody with a story to say, yeah, but I'm not on a Jeffrey Epstein level, or I'm not on this level, so my story doesn't matter, you know. And it's like, no, all of these, like you said, you are all survivors, all activists. There's all pieces of this giant puzzle. And really, it's the landscape of the world that's hidden from us, you know, and the more we can take those pieces and start putting them together, we start to get a construct of what reality actually is. And we can start to put together a plan on how do we change this? How do we make the future better? So how do we all break this generational stuff? Because that's what all child abuse is, you know, that continues through history. It's all generational, and there's all different types that never get broken, and more people continue to carry this pattern down. So what you're doing is so important. And I know that you might not even know the depth of people that you've inspired to either just, even if they're not speaking out, just to be accepting of their story, to know that they're not alone, you know. And like I said, I feel your activism can touch on children that were in CPS and children that were in any way, shape, or form separated from that family environment at a young age. And I think a lot of people in general, even just going to a normal school system, can relate in some way to what you're saying. And so that's why I think your story is one of the most important, because the more your story touches more people's hearts than a lot of people. Not everybody can relate to something that's very tip of the iceberg on that, Epstein type level, but everybody can relate to that feeling of feeling lonely and feeling out of place and not feeling loved, and experiencing that down the road as an adult, and how that can affect somebody. So what you're doing is so important, Jo, and I'm so proud of you for coming out and sharing.
Oh, thank you.
And I'm so grateful for what you're doing, because I know it's so hard. It's like building a business, and trudging for 12 years and not making a dime from it. Like, it's hard, but once you reach that point where people start listening, that snowball just starts rolling. And I think that's where you're at. I think now, like this year of all times, next year, this snowball is just going to keep going, and your voice
Thank you.
And it's such a privilege to be able to share your story. So thank you so much for coming on here.
Oh, you make it easy, really easy. And thank you for giving me the space, enough time to talk about it, in a kind of not under any time pressure, because it's, yeah, I think tomorrow will be more difficult for me, but I think for the Sherborne stuff as well, a lot of it, so a lot of the victims are diagnosed with compound PTSD, CPTSD.
Okay.
And the reason for that is because you keep getting sent back to the same place. The trauma gets, nobody's hearing you. So term after term, it's the sort of the re-abusive nature of it, and no escape because you're incarcerated. And prep schools are really small places, and you've got the other children preying on you as well, because it's highly sexualized. So and that makes it a much greater taboo. The peer-on-peer abuse, it makes it much more difficult, especially for boys, to speak out about it. So I just wanted to mention the CPTSD because of the, how damaging it was to keep being returned. I hope other people can take something from it. That would be great. And I hope America takes on Loud Fence. That would be so cool.
I do too.
That Mark Ruffalo film. Did you remember what it was called? The Mark Ruffalo Catholic Church.
No, I keep forgetting.
I don't remember it. But yeah, I think Loud Fence could get big in America.
I do too.
But yeah, it started in Ballarat. Well, thank you, Emma. I was going to say see you tomorrow.
Yes. And for those of you listening, next week we're going to bring Jo back on, and she's actually going to disclose information about this elite system that she was a part of after going to boarding school as a young adult, that she's actually never talked about before. And it's pretty groundbreaking. And her and Molly Skye Brown, who you guys are familiar with her Ghislaine Maxwell Epstein story, their stories actually intertwine in really interesting ways. And as I said at the beginning, we might bring, if possible, if Molly's available.
That'd be fun. That'd be fun. I think we'll have a party.
I know, it's so fun. So you guys are gonna get a whole different aspect of Jo's life. Her experiences are just absolutely invaluable, and you're gonna learn so much. And I encourage you guys to please go follow her social media, connect with her, support her, elevate her voice. Go check out Loud Fence. I'll actually link that below so you guys can go check that out. And hopefully we get some champions that are listening that say, hey, I want to start this in my city, or I'm going to get a group of people.
Yeah.
I'd love to see that grow too with the help of people.
There's a Twitter account for Loud Fence as well, with the noisy ribbons. That's the one.
Perfect. I'll link that below.
You can approach them directly. Lovely. Thank you so much.
Of course. And then I encourage everybody, if you guys support this show, please share this episode. If you found value, post about it on social media, go post about it on Twitter, tag us, find us, connect with us, subscribe. Algorithms don't work well for survivors or activists. We're always pushed down and censored. So all of your help getting this information out and supporting all of our platforms, it helps us get these messages out to a wider audience. So we'd appreciate your help with that. If you find value, subscribe to the channel, share it with your friends. get this episode out, elevate Joe's voice. That's what we do. This platform is about her. These episodes, this is her show today. So help spread the word, support her, and support our sponsors, the Save Our Children podcast with Becky and Bridget. I have that link below. They're a sister podcast. They talk about the parenting aspect of child abuse and how to take this information, bring it in a home to make and help facilitate a successful family life. And then also reparenting our own inner child, which we all need to do. So check their podcast out. And then also go follow Hatch Truth on Telegram. It's the fastest growing truth community, and they're just fantastic with keeping you guys updated on news. And they support this podcast. They reached out personally to me and said, hey, I believe in what you're doing. How can I support it? So they actually give you guys a discount code on their merchandise site. I don't benefit at all from it. I don't make any money from it, but it's a gift from them to you because they appreciate what we're doing here. So go support all of that. It's all linked below. And we will see you guys next week for part 2 of Joe's story. Joe, thank you again for being here with me today.
Thank you so much. God bless.
God bless.
Take care, everybody. Thank you so much.
We'll see you guys next week.